The sun had long since sunk behind the jagged peaks, casting a dark, menacing shadow over the dense forest that sprawled across the mountain range. A group of hikers, 5 friends in their early 30s, had been making their way along the trail all day, eager to reach the summit by nightfall. They were seasoned, confident, and unaware of the horrors awaiting them. The forest, lush and thick with ancient trees, stood still and silent, as though it were watching them. The air was thick with humidity, the trees pressing in on them as if the very woods were closing ranks. A sharp tang of rust filled their nostrils. For all its grandeur, the forest was unsettling, its dark shadows offering only a faint hint of the true terror that lurked deeper within. As the light dimmed, the hikers stumbled across an old, crumbling shack hidden among the trees. It looked abandoned, its wood rotting away, its windows long shattered. They decided to rest there for a while, hoping to regain their strength before continuing. There was something off about the place, but fatigue gnawed at them more than their sense of unease. They made camp, settling down in a small clearing near the shack. The hours passed. The winds picked up, whistling through the branches like distant whispers. No one spoke of it, but everyone felt it, a gnawing sense of being watched. A strange feeling prickled the back of their necks, a sense of wrongness in the air. And then it began. The first death came quietly. The youngest of the group, a tall man named Sean, was the first to go. He had been the most carefree of them all, joking and laughing the entire hike. But now, as the others sat around the fire, Sean wandered off into the woods to relieve himself. He had barely ventured beyond the tree line when the air grew still. The crunch of his footsteps stopped. The others didn't think much of it at first. But when 10 minutes passed and Sean hadn't returned, concern began to rise. They called his name, their voices ringing through the trees. But it was as if the forest swallowed their words. A scream cut through the silence. It was a strangled cry, then a wet, sloshing noise that echoed unnervingly. Panic surged through the group. They sprinted towards the sound, only to find Sean, his body suspended, a series of thick steel wires wrapped around his neck, mouth agape in a silent scream. His body had been hoisted into the air, his limbs tangled in a network of razor-sharp wires, making him a grotesque puppet hanging from a tree. His throat was slashed open, blood dripping like crimson rain to the forest floor. A cold realization settled in their bones. They weren't alone. The forest was a trap. The second death was a blur of violence. The group barely had time to mourn Sean. A sharp snap like the crack of a whip reverberated through the trees. They looked up, just in time to see Kelly, the smallest and most agile of the group, disappear into the underbrush, her scream torn from her throat. They rushed after her, but it was too late. Kelly had triggered a snare. Thick vines shot from the ground, wrapping around her arms and legs, pulling her upward like a doll caught in a trap. Her body twitched in agony as she dangled helplessly in mid-air. But that wasn't the worst of it. From the shadows a low growl rumbled. Something moved in the darkness, something human-shaped but wrong, grotesque. The figure emerged, dragging behind it a jagged, rusted blade. It was a man, or had been once. His skin was pale and stretched tight over a skull, his face barely recognizable as human, his eyes wild with insanity. The blade gleamed in his hand as he advanced. He struck with savage speed, slicing into Kelly's exposed belly. Her scream was choked off as blood sprayed from the wound. The madman slashed again and again, cutting through flesh and bone, the sickening sound of her organs being torn from her body, filling the night air. Kelly's body jerked with the last spasms of life before going completely still, her blood dripping to the forest floor in dark pools. The madman dragged her limp form toward the darkness, vanishing like a shadow in the trees. The third death was silent but excruciating. Only 3 remained. A couple, Ryan and Jane, and Tom, the most logical and level-headed of the group. They didn't speak. What was there to say? The terror had turned their muscles to stone. They moved cautiously, eyes darting around, alert to any movement in the night. Tom led the way, eyes scanning the ground for any sign of traps, but they weren't fast enough. He stepped into a hidden pit. the ground giving way beneath him. He screamed, but it was quickly silenced as the pit closed in around him, the sides slick with wet earth and sharp rocks. He tried to climb out, but his hands found only spikes hidden beneath the soil. They tore into his palms, his fingers slipping in the blood that poured from his wounds. Desperation rose in him as he struggled, but the more he moved, the deeper the spikes drove into his flesh. Eventually he went still. His body shuddered one last time before the darkness took him, his legs now twisted at an unnatural angle from the fall. Ryan and Jane tried to help, but they were too late. The final death came from nowhere. As the night wore on, Ryan and Jane made their way deeper into the woods, both frantic and breathless. They had to escape. They couldn't stay here. The forest was alive, its very soil out for their blood. The ground shifted again, but this time it was different. As they rushed forward, the trees around them seemed to bend, leaning in closer, their branches like long, grasping fingers. Ryan turned to look back at Jane, but she was gone. One moment she was beside him, and the next, nothing. A sudden, brutal force slammed into him from behind. He was thrown to the ground with a sickening thud, his face meeting the earth with bone-crushing impact. The madman was on him in an instant, his pale hands pressing down on Ryan's chest. Ryan struggled, his limbs weak from fear and exhaustion, but the madman was relentless. The blade came down again, this time cutting through his throat with surgical precision. Blood sprayed into the air, pooling beneath him as his body convulsed. The madman didn't stop. He carved into Ryan's chest, opening him up like a gutted animal. Jane, meanwhile, was trapped, caught in a pit of vines and wire that wrapped around her torso and legs, pulling her apart. She couldn't scream, couldn't move, her limbs stretched to the breaking point. The madman stepped back, watching his work with a sick, twisted pleasure, as the two last hikers were dragged into the dark, their bodies broken, their souls torn. He was already preparing for the next set of victims, setting his traps with meticulous care, his twisted mind already thinking ahead to those who would follow. The forest grew still again. Only the wind and the haunting echo of distant screams remained. And then, silence.